followers. Today I'm going to tell you so good and one just had to follow throughout history. Share this story. I'll share this story with you accompanied by the soothing sound of the fireplace. This story was created with the help of artificial intelligence. I'll be sharing different historical stories with you every day. Please subscribe. Telling me city in the world you're watching from. I hope you all enjoy the video. Chapter 1. World of rules, why read it existed more than manners. The machinery of social control. There is a moment somewhere in almost a generation of women's history when someone sat down and decided to write a book, not a novel, not a philosophical treatise, not a religious text, a book of rules about how to sit and how to stand, how to eat and how to speak, and how to receive, how to dismiss servants, how to address a husband, and how to conduct a superior. Before a superior, these books, courtesy manuals, management etiquette volumes, domestic conduct texts, represent one of the most remarkable bodies of literature ever produced. Remarkable not for their literary ambition, but for the extraordinary specificity and occasional surreal elaborateness of their prescriptions for female behavior. Sphere. We tend to dismiss etiquette, the province of fussy aunts and outdated social anxiety. The domestic lives of women throughout history were not trivial in their intent or consequences. They were the written codification of a specific social order, an attempt to inscribe in what happened place of acceptable femininity in a given time and place. Transgressing these rules faux pas. It was, in many contexts, a form of social rebellion that could result in consequences ranging from social ostracism to legal jeopardy. The woman who failed to behave correctly was not rude. She was potentially dangerous. A fabric whose entire structural intended on well performing with sufficient consistency and conviction. But these rules were also, in many cases, genuinely bizarre. Not just restrictive, unfair, actively, strikingly, sometimes laugh out loud, strange, in their specificity, their underlying assumptions, and the implicit picture they paint of the world their authors inhabited. The housewife of the Victorian era who was instructed never cross her legs at the ankle in case the sight of the connection between her feet stood to the existence of legs above them. The Renaissance Italian noblewoman who was required to maintain an expression of us contentment and at all times, even during childbirth. The Confucian wife of imperial China, who instructed not to laugh, to lie in a way that showed her teeth. The American housewife of the 1950s, who was advised to reapply her lipstick before her husband returned from work, and to greet him at the door with a cheerful smile, even if she had just received terrible news. All of these are historical realities documented in the books and the contemporary produced women. This is the story of those rules, where it came from, what they were trying to achieve, how women navigated them, subverted them, occasionally embraced them, and ultimately outlived them. It is a story that spans 3,000 years and dozens of cultures. And it is a story of control, of creativity, of suffering, of resilience, and of the endlessly invisive of human capacity to make a full and meaningful life within the most absurd of constraints. Chapter 2. Ancient Rules. Greece, Rome, and the first housewife Greek ideal. The invisible woman, the ancient Greeks, who gave voice and civilization so much of its philosophical and artistic foundation, also bequeathed it some of its most extreme prescriptions for female invisibility. The Athenian ideal of female virtue, as articulated by philosophers, playwrights, and the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, was essentially the ideal of the unseen woman. The Athenian orator Pericles, in his famous oration, as recorded by Thucydides, offered what he presented as the highest pity as praise for the widows of the Athenian war dead. The woman of greatest virtue is she whom least is spoken, whether for praise or for blame. The best thing a respectable Athenian woman, in other words, was to be so effaced the more you also thought her at all. This all I do had specific implications for Athenian housewives. The Oeconomicus of Xenophon, in which the wealthy gentleman farmer Ischomachus explains how he trained his young wife to manage their household, is one of the most revealing documents in the history of domestic etiquette, and one of the strangest. Ischomachus describes his wife as having been presented to him at the age of approximately 15, having trained from childhood to see, hear, and ask as little as possible. His project is to supplement this basic training in female nullity, the physical, technical, and managerial skills required to run a large household. But throughout his account, the fundamental virtue of the respectable Greek housewife remains her willingness, directed and defined the male of the household rather than by any intimacy. Own. The Greek rules for housewives be extended it to most trivial physical details. The respectable Athenian matron was expected to move through her house quietly, without the sound of footsteps that might announce her presence unnecessarily. She was expected to maintain an expression of modest, downward eye, and as it's that the habit of modest self-effacement intact. She was not to use cosmetics beyond most minimal application. White lead to the face, which was, from our modern perspective, it's a distinctly alarming practice, given that white lead is highly toxic. On the grounds that elaborate cosmetic decoration was the mark of a woman who wished to attract male attention, and the male attention a married woman should wish to was already permanently available through her husband. Roman rules. The virtuous Roman matron, wife, operated within a somewhat but equally elaborate system of behavioral prescription. The Roman ideal of the virtuous matron, the matrona, required a combination of qualities that the Roman culture summarized in the word pudicitia, a concept that translated roughly as chastity, modesty, and the public decorum appropriate to a woman of her status. Pudicitia was not merely a sole virtue. It was a comprehensive social posture, governed everything from the way a woman walked to the way she spoke to the clothes she wore in public. The Roman housewife's dress code was one of the most elaborate codified aspects of her daily existence. The stola, the long woolen garment that was the prescribed matron, merely clothing. It was a legal and social marker of status that carried specific behavioral implications. A woman who wore the stola in public was advertising her status as a respectable married woman and was therefore under the protection of the laws against sexual harassment or assault of respectable women, but this protection came with obligations. The woman in the stola was expected to behave at all times with the decorum to her dress. Any breach of this decorum was treated as a betrayal of the social contract that the stola represented. One of the most peculiar Roman that requirements for housewives concerned the practice of kissing, the ias osculi, the rite of kiss. Was as a legal institution by which male relatives of a Roman woman to smell her breath when greeting her, to verify that she had not been drinking wine. Roman law custom freeborn women from undiluted wine. Prohibition that mixed genuine concern about with the social control function of requiring to submit to inspection by their male relatives. Valerius Maximus, writing in the 1st century CE, recorded with approval that in the early Roman period, caught drinking wine could be legally killed by her husband, and noted several cases in which this penalty had been applied. Chapter 3, Me, Prescriptions. The Good Wife's Guide, The Good Men of Paris, and The Perfect Wife's, but what's in it in 1393, a wealthy Parisian bourgeois sat down and wrote an extraordinarily detailed manual of detailed conduct for his young bride. The text, known as the Ménagier de Paris, the women of the most complete and most revealing documents of medieval domestic life, medieval conceptions of proper wifely behavior that has survived to the modern day. Its author was a man of some education and considerable wealth. A wife in her teens who had recently arrived from a provincial background and whom he was apparently genuinely fond of. Despite the unmistakable patriarchal authority that pervades every page of his guidance, the goodman's instructions for his wife cover every aspect of domestic life, household management, cooking, gardening, and the management of servants. But they also include an elaborate framework of behavioral prescriptions to reveal severity of Peruvian man, Parisian man, expected from a respectable wife. She was to be entirely obedient to her husband in all things, and this obedience was to be emotional, but in her physical bearing and her emotional presentation. She was never to contradict her husband in public. even if she knew him to be wrong. She was to maintain a pleasant and warm expressions, regardless of her own emotional state. She was to defer to his judgment on all matters of household management. While all the practical work of household management herself. A combination that required complete competence and complete parent subordination. Some of the Goodmans more specific venture into territory. Into modern readers find either touching or alarming, depending on their perspective. He instructs his wife on the proper management of her female servants, a mixture of practical with and revealing assumptions. Should treat them kindly, but firmly, should know their characters and vulnerabilities, and should be aware that servants who are treated too gently will take advantage, while those treated too harshly. He describes, with an apparently sincere concern for the comfort of both humans and animals, the proper method of removing fleas from a bed. A procedure involving the examination of the bed's surface in candlelight before retiring, the identification and removal any fleas found, and the maintenance of a warm object near the bed from the remaining fleas from the sleeper. That this counts as essential guidance for a young wife tells us in medieval domestic life and the boundaries of what the medieval housewife was expected to manage. The courtesy books rule period, the period produced a substantial body of literature known as courtesy books. Texts directed at various audiences, including women of different social classes, that prescribed correct behavior every social occasion. The rules for housewives contained in these texts range from the practically sensible to the genuinely peculiar. Women were instructed not to eat so voraciously at table that feet fell from their mouths. That's a real behavioral tendency. They were instructed not to scratch that table, not to pare their teeth with a knife, not to blow their nose on the tablecloth, and not their mouths on the back of their hands. Other medieval courtesy rules addressed the issue of female laughter. Appears to have been a matter of unmatterable social anxiety in the medieval period. The respectable woman was expected to laugh in a manner that was controlled, quiet, and most importantly, that did not reveal her teeth. Open-mouthed laughter that displayed was considered immodest to the point of indecency in some medieval literature. Apparently on the grounds that it displayed a kind of unself-conscious physical enjoyment that was that with dignity. The correct female laugh, as described in various medieval texts, was a closed-mouth smile accompanied by a slight and controlled sound of amusement. An expression that conveyed appreciation of humor without any suggestion that the woman's body might be capable of uncontrolled physical response. Medieval rules for a housewife's physical movement were equivocal and equally revealing. A respectable woman was expected to walk at a measured and hurried pace. With small steps, her eyes cast slightly downward, her arms held close to her body. Running was absolutely prohibited for adult women because it was physically harmful, but because the physical evidence of exertion, the visibility of the body in running produced, were incompatible with female dignity. The rule against running was so thoroughly internalized in certain medieval and early modern contexts that the physical of flushed face, rapid breathing, disheveled hair, was itself interpreted as a sign of moral disorder, as if the body's willingness to move quickly was evidence of some corresponding far the East's rules for wives, the 3 obediences, and the 4 virtues. Confucian, wifely conduct, the Chinese Confucian tradition, produced one of the most systematic and most comprehensively elaborated frameworks for the domestic in the history of the world. A framework Nigerian, Korean, and 2000 series and whose at the center of this framework were the 3 obediences and the 4 virtues. Formulation of the essential requirements of proper femininity. Femininity was so thoroughly embedded cultures it influenced that it was transmixed, not just texts, but in proverbs, folk songs, popular theater, and the everyday social observations of ordinary families. The 3 obediences required a woman to obey her father before marriage, her husband after marriage, and her son after the husband. The 4 virtues required proper virtue or morality, proper speech, proper appearance, and proper work. These principles were elaborated in enormous enormous detail in the text's female instruction that the Confucian produced, beginning with the remarkable Ban Zhao's admonitions for women of approximately 80 CE, which remains one of the most influential texts on female conduct ever written, and which was composed by a woman, one of the first female historians and scholars in Chinese history, who appears to have genuinely believed in the virtue system she was prescribing, even as she demonstrated in her own accomplished scholarly life a capacity for intellectual achievement that the system she described would not have encouraged in ordinary women. The specific behavioral prescriptions of the Confucian housewife tradition areas and that Western etiquette tended to leave unaddressed. A wife's manner of speaking governed by rules that went beyond requirements of balance and modesty, appropriate volume, tone, and content of female speech in different domestic contexts. She was not to speak unless spoken to in the presence of her parents-in-law. She was not to speak of matters that concerned the public world. Politics, commerce, legal affairs, as these were male domains. She was not to speak of matters that concerned other households or other families, families. The quotes. Qualities to the four virtues, and she was most emphatically not to raise agreement with her husband, even if he was factually wrong, especially wrong as display of a wife's superior knowledge or was one of the most profound violations of the recognized Japanese rules. The art of serving, the Japanese tradition of female domestic conduct, by a combination of Confucian principle imported from China, indigenous Japanese and aesthetic values. This is the different of historical periods in Japanese. The rules for wives and housewives in samurai class families during the Edo period, Edo period is 603 to 3 to 13 to 868, were among the most elaborately codified in the world, reflecting the rigid social stratification of the period and the specific expectations attached to the social position of the samurai family. One of the most famous texts of female Japanese tradition is the Onna Daigaku, attributed to the Confucian scholar Kaibara, and dating the early 18th century. The text prescribes female conduct in minute detail and is notable. It listens assumptions about female character. It states plainly that women are by nature foolish, prone to jealousy, and inclined excessive talking. Deficiencies of female nature require constant corrective discipline of the rules prescribes. A woman's duty, the Onadaika insists, is to serve husband's parents, her husband, and the household as if her entire existence no purpose beyond this service. And indeed, by implication, it does not. The specific rules of the Ona Daigaku venture into behavioral territory that modern readers find both intrusive and succinct. A wife was not to have the house without her husband's explicit permission. She was to eat only after the members of the household above her in the hierarchy had eaten. She was not to sit in the presence of her parents-in-law. Being needed to do so, she was to perform the specific acts of physical service to her parents-in-law, bringing warm water, washing, preparing their food, attending to their physical comfort. That the text prescribed detail, and she was, above all, to all times of cheerful willingness that masked whatever feelings she may be experiencing. The appearance of contentment was required whether or not any contentment was felt. Chapter 5a, Tudor and Stuart England. The Obedient Wife, a homily on the state of matrimony. Official religion and wifely submission. In 1563, the Church of England published an homily of the state of matrimony. Text that was read aloud allowed churches that prescribed the proper conduct of married life with the full authority of the established. The homily's instructions for wives drew on St. Paul's epistles and on the English common law tradition to produce a comprehensive account of wifely duty that was simultaneously a legal document and a behavioral manual. Wives were instructed to be subject to their husbands' things, to keep silence in the house, to let her husbands be their heads and their rulers, and to be meek and patient in adversity, including the homily specified with startling candor the adversity of a violent husband. The homily's instructions on the management of a difficult husband are among the most remarkable passages in the history literature. rather than advising women to seek protection from abusive husbands, was in principle available in Tudor England through the church courts. The homily instead advises them to to seek to correct their husbands through the example of their own virtuous behavior, and to reflect that their sufferings were opportunities for spiritual merit. The explicit instruction that a wife should not strike back if struck, should not argue, and should not send outside assistance is framed not as a capitulation to injustice, but as a positive spiritual discipline, the highest expression of Christian wifely virtue. The domestic etiquette manuals, edited manuals of Tudor and Student, the housewife's behavior in a remarkable range of specific situations. She was instructed on the proper management of her household, the symbolic and practical marker of her domestic authority. But she pursuing her purse at all times to surrender immediately on her husband's request without question or comment. She was instructed on the proper way to receive her husband's guests, which required to be present and to present welcoming door, to ensure that the household was in good order, and that refreshments were available, and then in many accounts to withdraw from the male company to her own quarters. Once the social obligations of the Indian had been discharged, rules about the body, corsets, posture, physical femininity required of the early modern English housewife extended to her body in ways that far influenced any earlier period. The rise of the corset as an element of females in the 16th century transformed the female silhouette, but also transformed the female experience of her own body in ways that had direct implications for behavior. A tightly laced corset dramatically the wearer's stability, deeply restricting the expansion of the lungs and producing the shallow, rapid breathing that contemporary observers associated with female delicacy, but that was, in chemical terms, simply the respiratory response to constricted ribcage expansion. The corset also enforced a specific posture, up, with the shoulders back and the chest forward, simultaneously associated with female dignity and with the socially prescribed orientation of the female body toward display and in readiness for male evaluation. The woman who slumped or was both last. and the choice grass was designed to enforce. To enforce. The corset was, in this sense, an etiquette. And its roommate material. Behavioral. Of upright, dignified bearing to a physical reality that was maintained whether the wearer was or not. Chapter 6. The Victorian Housewife. The Golden Age. The Golden Age of the feet and its belief management studio no domestic management. Single figure largery of domestic firms, housewives, then Isabel's wives that an Isabellade was book about abegement, was book how and first thing to King someone that is age 681 in 1961 became one of the best-selling books of Victorian era and remained in continuously for well over a century. Mrs. Beaton. She was 20 when the book was published and died at 28. Having produced four children in 4 years of marriage, compiled an astonishing compendium of culinary instruction, household management advice, and social etiquette prescription, codified the expectations of the Victorian middle class housewife with the thirtieth domestic manual had approached. The etiquette of Mrs. Beaton's work addressed the Victorian housewife societies. The same duties, the same systematic that she brought to the domestic economy. Calling card art etiquette alone occupies several pages. The exact circumstances under what a card should be left rather than a personal call made. The precise position in which the card should be placed on the silver kept in the hall for the purpose. The correct response to a card left during the housewife's absence and frequency of return calls that propriety required. The calling card system of the Victorian era was an extraordinarily elaborate social technology, and the housewife who navigated it incorrectly social consequences that ranged from mild embarrassment to complete exclusion from the social circle to which she aspired. Victorian etiquette manuals prescribed behavioral rules that extended into every imaginable domestic situation, including some that modern specific. The housewife was not to acknowledge acquaintances in the street unless they acknowledged her first. The social greeting was apparently socially that the safer course was to maintain apparent blindness toward any known person until had committed themselves. She was not to speak of illness at dinner table that reflected both the Victorian horror of bodily discussion in the context and the practical consideration. Many dinner parties included elderly guests. It's alarming. The rules of morning calls. Elaboration ritual, the morning call, which took place not in the morning, but in the early afternoon. Typically be between 3 and 5 o'clock. Was one of the central social institutions of Victorian middle-class life, and the re-governing were among the most elaborate and most specifically of all Victorian. A morning call lasted between 15 and 20 minutes. Never shorter, as brevity was rude, never longer, as overstaying was equally rude. The caller was to remove her outer garments in the hall, but retain her gloves throughout the call. Removing one's gloves during a morning call was considered an indication of an intention to stay longer than the call's prescribed duration, which was socially alarming. She was to sit of chair, not the armchair, that indicated a settled intention to remain backed straight bend near the door that signaled an appropriate occupation of the host's drawing room. The conversation permitted during a morning call was prescribed with specificity. Controversial topics: religion, personal finances, illness, death, or any matter generate strong emotion were to be avoided entirely. The weather was always an acceptable topic, not because Victorian housewives were obsessed with meteorology, because the weather was a subject on which everyone had an opinion. No opinion was offensive, and the discussion could be sustained for the required duration on anything that might occasion. Other acceptable topics included the mild description of recent social events attended by both colossus, the health of mutual acquaintances, as long as the description remained vague and optimistic, and the new acquisition, furniture, ornament, garden improvement, visible in the drawing room. The exit from the morning call was governed by specifics as elaborate as those governing the entry. The caller was to rise from her chair and make the indication of her intention to leave before this showed any sign of relief approaching conclusion of the call. The social taboo against making the house company and insufficiently enjoyable required the caller to perform the departure as a reluctant withdrawal rather than an eager escape. The correct exchange of departing pleasants had to be conducted while standing, never while still seated, as sitting down again, and require the leave the things or tire leaving ritual to be repeated from the beginning. Chapter 7, American rules, the rules, and its Housewives, Republican motherhood, and the duty of the American life occupied a curious position in the social and intellectual history of the new republic. A position that combined the genuine elevation of women's domestic role to form of civic duty with the practical maintenance of all the behavioral restrictions. The concept of Republican motherhood developed in following the American Revolution, argued that success of the democratic experiment depended on the virtue of its citizens, and that the virtue of its citizens depended on the moral instruction of their mothers. The American housewife was therefore merely a domestic manager, a patriotic institution, the guardian of the national, the primary educator of your citizens, who would sustain or tray the democratic ideal. This Asian benefit. Remarkable policy of the 19th century. It states, Catherine Beecher, sister of Harriet Beecher Stowe, of Uncle Tom's Cabin, produced in her treatise on domestic economy of 1841. Its successor, The American Woman's Homes, 1869, co-authored with her famous sister. What amounted to a comprehensive manifesto for the professionalization of housewifery. Beecher's argument was that the management of a household was a skilled occupation of genuine intellectual and social importance. Equivalent to the management of the business or the business of and that profession, and that American women should approach it with the same systematic rigor that a professional. The specific etic rule and that is the rules that the American domestic manuals prescribed with the socialism, the egalitarian of American culture, and its persistent social anxieties and status. American etiquette writers were to distinguish American manners from the rigid class-based of European aristocratic culture, insisting that American politeness was democratic, on genuine mutual respect, rather than on the hierarchical deference European etiquette required. Yet the specific rules they prescribed often reproduced European class distinctions in a new vocabulary, translating the English between and servant into the American distinction between the respectable housewife and the immigrant domestic employee, with a corresponding set of behavioral prescriptions how each should conduct herself in the domestic space they shared. The Gilded Age, status, servants, and society. Rapid economic growth of the Gilded Age. The decades after the Civil War, during which American industrial wealth created a new plutocracy of extraordinary opulence, produced an equally rapid proliferation of social anxiety about status and its correct expression. The nouveau riche families of the post-Civil War period had money, assumed as its birthright, and the demand for guidance on how to behave correctly in the unfamiliar social situations that wealth made accessible, a market for etiquette literature. Publishers eager to supply the etiquette rules prescribed for American housewives in the Gilded Age combined genuine socially with prescriptions of striking peculiarity. The housewife advised on the correct to manage a dinner party, 20 guests, using only 4 servants. A logistical challenge required not merely culinary skill, but the management of simultaneous, complex social interactions, according to elaborate rules of precedence that determined who should be seated next to whom based on the relative social seniority. She was advised on the correct form of address to different categories of social superior. Between the forms appropriate. For writing to a United States Senator, a Supreme Court Justice, a bishop of the Episcopal Church, a professor at a leading university, and a wealthy merchant who had recently been received into good society. Most modern Americans would find both baffling, unnecessary, but the Gilded Age treated as a matter of serious social importance. Chapter 8, the Edwardian and years, the last age formality, the perfect Edwardian housewife. Detail as through the Edwardian era roughly decade of Edward VI's reign from 901 to 1901 to 1910. Though the term is used more broadly to cover the period up to the First World War, was in many respects the apotheosis of formal domestic etiquette for the middle class housewife. The social confidence of late Victorian England had accumulated a body of behavior of extraordinary alertness, and the Edwardian housewife and was expected to internalize and apply rules governing every aspect of her domestic and social life, and substance with a consistency and precision that left very little to individual judgment. The Edwardian rules for the management of the domestic staff were among the most elaborate and most revealing of the period etiquette literature. The housewife was not to speak to the cook about the menu for the following day in the kitchen itself. This was the cook's domain, and entering it for purposes of instruction was an invasion could compromise the cook's dignity and her efficiency. Instead, the morning menu conference was to be held in the dining room, wife's sitting room, with the cook standing while the housewife sat. The housewife was not to thank a servant for ordinary service. A thank you for a service was merely the performance of a servant's paid duty, implied of equality, was disruptive. She was to use the imperative rather than an interrogative when issuing instructions. No, please, as the interrogative implied possibility of refusal. Inconsistent with the proper relationship between housewife and domestic employee. The Edwardian rules for the housewife's own presentation at different times were equally specific. She was required to wear a morning dress, a practical but still respectable garment appropriate for the management of household tasks. During the morning, she was to change afternoon dress for the period of afternoon calls and potential received visitors. She was to change again into appropriate dinner dress, even if only the family were dining at home, as the maintenance of proper dress standards, even in the absence of observers, was itself a virtue, an expression of self-respect and the maintenance of proper domestic standards, that the lack of an audience made more rather than less in the interwar years. Rules in transition, the catastrophe of the First War disrupted the elaborate social order of Edwardian England in ways directly affect the domestic life and behavioral expectations of the British housewife. The mass death of the young men who had filled the service that renewed many middle-class families' ability to maintain domestic staff. The entry of women in the paid workforce in large numbers for the first time, and the general social disruption that followed 4 years industrial-scale warfare all created conditions in which the elaborated pre-war period could no longer be maintained by most of the families they had observed it. The etiquette manuals of the 1930s show the adaptation in progress. A gradual simplification of the most elaborate formalities combined with determined insistence that the essential principles of proper domestic behavior remain if some of their delegation had changed. The calling card system was to have largely into disuse among the younger generation. But the underlying principle of managing social relationships through the careful regulation of visits and social obligations in a simplified form. The requirement to dress for dinner, for relaxed, for but retained for social occasions. The rules about addressing servants were preserved largely intact, even as the number of servants in middle-class households declined dramatically. Chapter 9. The 1950s. The Perfect Housewife's Goldwife's Better Homes, and the servants in the 1950s and 1940s. Housewife occupies a peculiar place in cultural memory. She is simultaneously an object of nostalgia, and a figure of horror. An icon of domestic contentment and a symbol of social limitation, a historical reality, and a mythology. The behavioral prescription directed at the American middle-class housewives in the post-war decade. Among the most specific and most elaborately detailed, and the Victorian period, combining the traditional requirements of domestic competence and social decorum with a new emphasis on psychological cheerfulness, the performance that reflected the specific anxieties. Consumer society. The domestic advice literature of the 1950s, magazine like Good Housekeeping, Ladies' Home and a Home, Better Homes and Gardens, the domestic curricula of high school home economics classes, the advice columns of countless newspapers, creatures, prescribed a visual housewife that was simultaneously aspirational and anxiety-inducing. She was to maintain a perfectly clean and orderly home at all times, not merely for the benefit of the family, but because a well-maintained home was the outward sign of a well-maintained character. Disorder in the domestic environment was read as evidence of disorder in the woman's psychological and morals. She was to prepare her nutritious and varied daily, using the increasingly abundant processed food products that the food industry was producing, while also maintaining the appearance of domestic crafts fit lazy. From the Lazy One, perhaps the most revealing of all 1950s domestic etiquette prescriptions was the advice widely reproduced in magazines, advice columns, and home economics, home textbooks about how our wife should greet her husband on his return from work. She was to have applied fresh lipstick and checked her hair before he arrived home. To him at the door with a warm and genuinely pleased expression. Not merely of pleasure, but a deliberate cultivation of the emotional state that would make such an expression authentic. She was to have the children presentable and under control. She was to have preparing his meal. She was inquire about his day with genuine interest. She was, above all, not to burden him with the problems until he had time to decompress from the stresses of the masculine world of paid employment that he had been navigating while she was, by implication, pleasantly occupied in the domestic sphere. The hidden rules, what never written rules of forbid, were supplemented equally extensive. Social expectations so thoroughly internalized that they didn't need to because they were communicated by the broader cultural environment without reinforcement. The 1950s housewife's wife understood, being explicitly told that she was not to express ambivalence about her domestic role in settings. That appropriate response to any question about her life as a housewife was an expression of contentment and fulfillment. She understood that the comparison of households, the implicit kitchen was cleaner, children better dressed, rose garden more impressive. was a constant feature of the suburban social environment, and that and then within a neighborhood community depended on her consistent performance of domestic excellence. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, published in Feminine, published in 1963, documented devastating psychologicals of these rules. The problem that has no name, as she famously called it, the pervasive happiness of educated American women who had been told that the domestic life was the natural fulfillment of the female nature, and who found in their split-level suburban homes that it was not enough. The rules had not changed. What had changed was the willingness of a significant in public and in print that following the rules had not made them happy, and that their happiness was a consideration that might be allowed to enter the calculation of Chapter 10, the rules of food, what, when, and how to eat the table as theater, at etiquette at meals, no at meals, no generate more elaborate etiquette prescriptions for housewives than the management of food and eating. The table, in virtually every culture and historical period, was understood as a social theater in which housewife's skill, status, and moral character were simultaneously displayed and evaluated, and the rules governing what to serve, how to present it, how to behave while serving it, and how to manage the social dynamics of the meal were among the most specific of all domestic etiquette. The rules about what a housewife and could not eat herself were, in many historical periods, among the most revealing of all domestic prescriptions. In the medieval period, the housewife of household was expected to eat modestly, to take smaller portions than at the table, to eat more slowly, and demonstrate through her table behavior the same control and restraint that the broader etiquette required of her body and emotions. She was not to appear hungry, even she was not to reach for food. She was to wait and food. It was until food was offered, until the conventions of the meal made it appropriate for her to serve herself. She was not to express preference for any dish on the table, as both reactions indicated an excessive engagement with the pleasures of the palate that was incompatible with female dignity. The rules about how a Victorian housewife was to manage the serving of a dinner party from the arrangement of the flowers on the table to the table, precise timing of the courses, to the management of the conversation among guests who might not know one another well. She was to ensure that no guest ever appeared without wine in front of them during the meal. The plate or glass. Negligence. She was to must manage the conversation at her end of the table, ensuring that no guest sat in socks without to manage it. The skillful hostess created the conditions for natural conversation rather than imposing a forced structure. She was, in short, to make the elaborate social production natural and calculated. The highest demanding requirement of all. Chapter 11 rules out the body, dress, appearance, and physical comportment. The clothed body as diplomacy, as social message, prescription of specific dress codes for housewives in different historical periods, represents one of the most consistent and most revealing categories of domestic etiquette, because clothing is instantaneously the most visible marker of social status and the most readable indicator of a non-pliant or client's requirements. The rules about what a housewife could and could not wear at different times of day and in different social situations were not arbitrary aesthetic preferences. They were delicate systems that communicated the wearer's status, her moral character, her household's economic position, and her degree of compliance with the prescriptions. The rules about morning dress, one of the modes of this dress code system. Victorian morning etiquette prescribed specific garments specific of grief following the deaths of relatives and these prescriptions extraordinarily detailed. A widow's mourning dress was required to be entirely black for the first year, and a day, the period, the mourning. And the black was required to be of a specific non-reflective fabric, typically Parramatta silk or bombazine, because any sheen in the fabric was considered too festive in character. The wearing of any jewelry other than jet, a form of black fossilized wood mined from Whitby in Yorkshire, was prohibited during deep mourning after the first year and a day. The widowess to a second stage of mourning permitted a slightly less interpretation of the black requirement, followed by half mourning, which permitted the introduction gray, mauve, and lavender, and then finally to ordinary dress. A widow who emerged from her mourning dress quickly, whether she intended it or not. About the depth of grief and the sincerity of her attachment to her late husband, the rules were not merely prescriptive, but interpretive. They provided a shared vocabulary of dress that allowed the entire community to review and widow and moral state from the color of her skirt. This interpretive function of mourning dress was so thoroughly internally internalized that the mourning rules enforced themselves through social pressure rather than any external sanction. The widow who wore gray at 8 months, rather than the required 12, the private disapproval and public comment of her social circle in a way that made formal legal necessary. Chapter 12. The legacy. The rules. The rules left behind the end of the end of etiquette following the decades. Decades following Freud's The Feminine Mystique in 1963 saw a rapid, jaw-eroded, and dramatic erosion of the domestic etiquette that had governed housewives' behavior for centuries. The women's liberation movement of the late 1960s and 1970s attacked not just the specific rules, the requirement to have dinner on the table at 6, to wear appropriate dress for every social occasion, to subordinate one's own needs and preferences to those of husband and children. But the underlying premise that the domestic role, the natural and fulfillment of the female nature, the rules, once exposed, once as rules, as rather no expressions of female instinct, lost much of their power to compel compliance. The story of domestic etiquette's decline is not quite the story of simple liberation that the feminist narrative of the period told. Sometimes told, the elaborate etiquette systems of the Victorian period were not purely mechanisms of female oppression. They were also systems of female solidarity, shared knowledge, and social organization within which women found genuine community, genuine skill, and genuine sources of dignity and self-respect. The morning call system, for all its rigidity, was a framework within which women maintained social connections, provided mutual support, and exercised genuine social judgment in ways that had real consequences for the communities they inhabited. the elaborate dinner party, for all the anxiety it generated. Also elaborated language, art form, and the skill of the accomplished hostess was a real skill that took years to develop and that commanded genuine respect. The rules also contained within them, despite their restrictive character, kind of female power, the calling card etiquette, the morning call system, the elaborate machinery of social visiting. All of this operated primarily among women, was organized by women, and gave women form of social agency within the social agency in the domestic sphere, that the formal exclusion of women from political and professional life did not otherwise provide. The housewife who navigated Victorian social with skills was of social intelligence and social power, that her excluded status in the public world did not diminish. The rules remained that from death. Domestic did not mean the death governing women's domestic behavior. The expectations attached to the role of wife and mother persist in the 21st century. They are now expressed in the language of choice, and the language of duty and subordination. The contemporary housewife who mainstreamed documenting her perfectly organized home, her elaborate homemade, her beautifully dressed children is, in some respects, performing the same function as her Victorian predecessor, who received morning callers in a perfectly maintained drawing room, indicating her social status and competence to a communitors who are admirers and judges. The rules have changed, and the changing of the rules has been a genuine gain in freedom. Women are no longer legally to subordinate themselves to their husbands. They are no longer socially penalized. In most contexts, pursuing professional ambitions, acknowledging the existence of their bodies. The most bizarre, the most oppressive of the historical rules examined in this journey is genuinely to be celebrated. What remains is a subtler of expectations, equally demanding in their own way, if less explicitly codified, about what it means to be a good wife, a good mother, good domestic manager in the contemporary world, whether these expectations are truly freely chosen, or whether they represent the same rules in a new vocabulary. is dependent that each channel is for themselves. And the epilogue, the rule that never changed the requirement to your content of all the rules, the rules. That's, and for housewives, across the 3,000 years we have examined in this story, one has appeared every time and every culture. In the Confucian conduct manuals of imperial China and courtesy books, the courtesy books, good housekeepings of 1950s in the writings of Roman moralists and Victorian editorialists. It is perhaps most demanding of all the rules, because unlike the rules about calling cards and morning dress and the management of servants, it cannot satisfied by simply performing the prescribed action. It requires not just behavior but an emotion. Or rather, it requires the performance of emotion, which is considerably more demanding than any equal performance. The rule appear happy, appear fulfilled by your domestic role, whatever your actual emotional state. Appear grateful for the husband, the house, the haldrons, the children, the domestic sphere. Do not express dissatisfaction with your lot. Do not reveal longing for any beyond what the domestic world provides, present to the world at all times, a face of benign contentment that assures those around you everything is exactly as it should be. This rule runs from Xenophon's advice about the ideal Athenian housewife through his instructions to his young wife, through the Japanese Onna Daigaku's requirement, a wife maintain an appearance of cheerful service. Through every Victorian manuals prescribe the serene and gracious hostess. The 90s tastes to the nice Betty's to greet you and smile. The reason this rule has been so universal and so persistent is that it is the most effective for maintaining order. The domestic role represents a woman who appears genuinely content with her. The domestic role raises no questions about whether that role is appropriate, whether it is fulfilling, whether it is just her contentment, or the appearance of it is a form of consent, a daily reaffirmation enacted in the muscles of Hephaestus of the legitimacy of the arrangements she lives. This is why the rule about appearing content and is not the foundational requirement all the rules follow. And it is why the moment when women began to say publicly, in large numbers and with genuine conviction, that they were not content, that the domestic role, however formed, and however decorated with etiquette, was not enough, was not merely a social change, but a revolution. The etiquette rules of are in the end the traces left by the conversations who had to follow them were not allowed to have out loud. The rules told those women what they're supposed to feel, what they were supposed to want, what kind of life they were supposed to regard as sufficient. That so many of them followed the rules so thoroughly for so long, without the open rebellion that the rules' demands might seem to have required, is not evidence that the rules were right, or that the women who followed them were unaware of their constraints. It is evidence of the extraordinary adaptability of the human spirit, and of the remarkable creativity which human beings, including human beings in the most restrictive of circumstances, find ways to live fully and meaningfully within whatever walls the world around them. The walls were real. Within them,